Good morning, everyone, or good evening, some people in these days. Welcome to this session. Professor Fan Li will give the first talk in this session. Professor Li is in the Department of Statistical Science as well as Department of Biostatistics and Bioinformatics at Duke University. Her main research interest is causal inference, and very excitingly, the connection between causal inference and machine learning. And today she will talk about, she has a very interesting title of the talk. So is being an only child harmful to psychological health? Evidence from a local instrumental variable analysis of the China one-child policy. So please, Professor Li.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning for the people in China. And it's really my pleasure to be actually the first speaker of the whole conference. And so I'm actually today talking about something quite applied work I've done, but I think it's very relevant to China. So as Quinn already explained, told the title. So it's about actually the being one only child and mental health relationship, and use evidence from the China data. So this is a joint work with Shu Xiden, my former student, who's now at Facebook, and Peng Ding at Berkeley. So the paper was published at JRSSA last year. So just what is the problem about? So we want to study this, but we want to study whether being the only child is harmful to psychological health. So this is actually in the psychology literature. There's a large literature on this, and the consensus is kind of sibling companion affect mental health positively. So this question is particularly relevant in China because probably most of you know that in China between 1979 to 2015 there was a very strict one-child policy, basically limit particular families from urban area to have only one child. So because of that, the data shows that it prevented 400 million births. And because of that, also we have a huge, a whole generation of only children in China. So there's a lot of study on the one-child policy and its influence on the society. So particularly Cameron et al. 2013, they studied this so-called generation of little emperors. That's in China we call the only children from this generation. And then the idea is actually the OCP, the one-child policy, is a strict policy, and it can be leveraged as a nature experiment, which we're going to also use in this particular study. And then he compared the individual born just before and after the OCP. And then he concluded that the only children are less trustworthy, more pessimistic, and more risk-taking. So not good news. But on the other hand, also there's another study to show that indeed, actually seemingly like being the only child have a positive effect on life cycle outcomes, including higher education and income levels. And very, very soon we will see that, okay, those kind of studies that like it's hard actually to draw causal conclusions of this kind of studies. So that's the goal of this study. Our study is actually try to weigh in this discussion by analyzing some a big survey data from China. So this we particularly use the China family panel study, CFPS. This study again, it's actually launched into 2010 by Institute of Social Science Survey in Beijing University, and I graduated from Beijing University, so it feels very nice to talk about this study here. So this survey is a national representative and annual longitudinal survey of the Chinese community families and the individuals. So it records a lot of information, including economic and non-economic well-being of the Chinese population, and the data is publicly available. So what we did in this study, I will explain a little bit more later, is we analyzed the data from the first national wave of this survey in 2010, and particularly we focus on a subsample of children born after 1979. Remember, we're not using this before, after that comparison, but our sample only consists of children born after 1979. Okay, so just a quick look at the data. So sample size, in our whole sample size, we have around 4,000 people. And so here, the only children is actually just about a quarter of them. And so if you just look at the family information, if you look at the family information, you can see that the only child overall, they are coming from wealthier family, and they have higher parental education, and also the family has higher divorce rate on average. And if we look at the individual information, also you can see that on average, in this case, that the only children they're younger, slightly younger than the non-single child, and the family size also differs. So you can see that normally the family have 2 to 4 kids. For this family have more than 1 kid, and then minorities, because of the policy, tend to have more children. So of course in China, 92% Han Chinese. So what is our outcome? So those are all backgrounds, baseline characteristics. So our outcome is it's a psychological. There's 3 measures. So they are because those are collected from questionnaires. So their confidence, anxiety, and death rates. There's 3 measures. So overall, and this is all measured. They're ordinal. They're measured on the Likert scale, so 1 to 5, and the higher means forgot the higher means what. Yeah. Anyway, so this is ordinal outcome. But overall, just look at this data. If you look at this look like exactly this. There's not much difference between the 2 groups, right? But of course, we know doing causal inference, we know like looking at this, you cannot just look at the main difference, because of there are plenty of important background covariates. The difference in that we haven't adjusted, right? So that was the data. So the challenges in doing statistical causal inference using this data is really kind of a common problem in causal study, because here the exposure of co-treatment is being a single child, right? Only child, but apparently that is not randomly assigned. So in fact, there's plenty of confounding between fraternity choice and mental health. This is well documented in other literature. The measured confounding can be children's age, number of siblings, or family income, and education, right? But they are, more importantly, there are unmeasured confounding there. For example, nurturing environment, that is very hard to measure, and we don't have data of that. Right, so in order to measure and to do this kind of evaluation, we essentially need a more exogenous shock that affect the fraternity choice only. So what do we do is, again, we utilize the average, the OCP, the one-child policy, we utilize as a nature experiment. So the idea is, even though this is a policy, but the intensity of implementing OCP actually differs quite a lot according to where you are. We know that in the in the bigger cities, apparently it's implemented more strict than in rural areas, things like that. So indeed, actually, Atani has a paper in 2002. So he developed this so-called indicator of family planning policy resistance. So this is essentially a measure of the intensity of the OCPs. So I'll show you. So this is a graph. So this measure is measured actually by province. So the higher, so it's a score between 0 to 100, and essentially the higher means the more resistance to one-child policy. So you can see that it's actually pretty interesting in some of the coastal area, and also in Inner Mongolia, and just some area in Sichuan. If you see that those provinces actually have higher, seem to have a higher resistance. With just the picture basically just show you that there's clearly intensity difference between different regions in China. Okay, so the idea is, well, then we can use this actually as well, because OCP is really OCP is a policy, right? But it indeed affects the fraternity choice. But apparently, where you are born is largely randomly assigned by nature, right? So then essentially we can use this kind of resistance of the resistance measure of OCP as a kind of instrumental variable. That was the idea. So indeed, who in 2014 actually used this IFPPR, this measure as instrumental variable. They also analyzed a subsample of the China family panel study I just mentioned, the survey. So what he did, what she did is a standard two-stage or three-stage B-squared, the traditional IV approach, and assuming homogeneous effect. But when we look at the data, we find that there are actually plenty of important complications that wasn't addressed. First, the data is clustered. The IV is clustered, and also the data itself, the families are from different provinces. That is important. And second, there's ordinal outcome. So it is really not a continuous outcome. So you cannot just use a regression model, linear regression, right? And also later I will say that in the in IV literature, there's a key assumption called exclusion restriction that might be violated too. And there are also estimate. I'll mention that a little bit later. The point is that, okay, so we are motivated by this study, but we feel that there's a lot of things that need to be taken care of. So our analytical strategy is actually to use this. So here, the IFPPR score is really a continuous variable. So this is like this is a case of continuous IV. So we use this so-called local IV approach that first developed by Heckman earlier, and then combined with hierarchical models. And then we also provide refined estimates to provide more information about the causal effect. And then we develop sensitive analysis. That's kind of the overview. So now I will get into a little bit more details of the application, of the statistical framework and the application. So here we have, so for the study, what we did was we actually divide the population, the sample, into 4 different subpopulations. They are male, female, and urban and rural. We basically did stratify the analysis. We did analysis in each of the 4 subgroups. The reason is, as you will see, that they're actually pretty, in China, the urban and the rural area, the big differences, and also there's big male and female differences. So we think that it makes sense to do a stratified analysis within each strata. And so each unit belongs to a cluster called CI, represents the province. Questions? Well, I'll continue then. So then each unit, so I is just unit, and each unit also have pre-treatment covariates. And then the treatment, we denote the treatment, quote treatment. Treatment here is TI, is really as a binary variable. So PT equal 1 means only child, and the 0 is otherwise. And the Y is a self-reported measure of. I think some people didn't mute. Please mute. Okay, so then the continuous. Okay, so then an important thing is the IV. So the IV we denoted by ZI, and it's a negative IFPPI. So it's basically this continuous IV just between a range. That's it. And now we need to define potential outcome in order to define our treatment effect as a whole model. And then the T, we call it TZ, is basically the potential treatment. Remember, we have IV, right? But the true treatment is binary. We have continuous IV. So for given each IV, so there's a potential treatment, have the IV of the unit I taking the value Z. And the Y, the outcome is really, it's a potential outcome. It's a function of both the IV value and the treatment. So it's a potential outcome of unit I exposed to IV, Z, and treatment level of T. Okay, so of course we only observe one of the many, one of the observed ones. So the TI is just TI. Yeah, I mean, we just observe the treatment and outcome corresponding to the observed IV value and the treatment value. Okay, so when I wrote this, of course, I make the implicit assumption that there's no interference between units. And so the first assumption is basically conditional on covariates. The IV is randomly assigned, so exogenous. And this is pretty standard in IV literature, and also in our application, we think this is reasonable. This basically say that where you're born, this is because where you're born in China is which province is really largely random. So then of course the IV can be viewed as randomized. And then the next, oopsie. Okay, so the next assumption is the basically says the IV is not weak. Well, in other sense, mathematically just say the probability of treatment equal 1 given the IV is a non-degenerate function in the IV for all x. So we draw this, you can see that we draw the quantiles of the IFPPR, the IV, the quantile, and we draw the probability of being only child as a function of the quantile of the IV. So you can see that clearly there's an increasing, there's a trend, basically say that, the higher resistance, we see higher resistance. Oh, we flipped it. So here, we flipped it. It's like we see higher resistance, the chance is around here. So the chance of the probability of being only child is decreasing. So the whole point is that this IV, actually, there's a pretty strong effect, correlation between the IV, the resistance or the IV value, and the probability of being the only child. And then another assumption we make is also pretty standard in IV literature. It's called monotonicity. This basically say that the treatment indicator, remember the binary treatment indicator is basically non-decreasing in Z for all the covariates. For all the units. So this essentially extends the monotonicity assumption on binary IV in the classic, the Angers-Imbens-Rubin paper on non-compliance. And this is assumption on individual behavioral type. And normally we think this is plausible because as the IV, as the resistance get higher, of course, the resistance level get higher, they're less likely, one is less likely to have been treated, essentially being an only child. And then fourth one is the key assumption is so-called the ER, exclusion restriction. So okay, what does this assumption mean? This assumption basically states that there's no direct effect from the IV to the outcome. So this basically say that the effect of the IV, the resistance to the policy, OCP policy, is the effect of that on the outcome, on the psychological health is only through its effect on the treatment, basically being the only child. And so because of this under this assumption, actually we can simplify the IV, we can simplify the potential outcome into a function just of T, the treatment. So under this exclusion restriction, then this, with the potential outcome is a function of only the treatment indicator. So IV, of course, is questionable because it's often questionable, but it's crucial. It's because there can be other, actually the OCP, the implementation intensity can affect the mental health through other pathways, but this assumption essentially ruled that out. And this is a very important assumption, but it's untestable based on the observed data. So our strategy is later we did some sensitivity analysis around this, as common in statistics, in causal inference. So I saw there's some questions. So maybe what I should do is, let me first run through this, and then we will handle questions at the end. I will try to finish it like 5 minutes before the end, okay? Okay, so now we need to define causal estimates. So causal estimate here is pretty simple. There's several causal estimates. The first is you're familiar with average treatment effect for the treated, the ATT. So the ATT, well, everyone knows what is ATT. I'm not going to say that. And then the other one is relevant to this particular case. It's called policy relevant treatment effect. So this is, again, raised by the Heckman paper. Oopsie. Heckman paper. So here is basically the contrast of Y1 and Y0. But conditional, so it's for the people who are, well, this basically say that when they are at the minimum of the IV value, the treatment is 0, and at the maximum of the IV value, the treatment is 1. So essentially, this says that this is the average treatment effect for the families that change their fertility choice due to the OCP. Okay, so that's what's called policy relevant treatment effect. And the last one is, we think is the most important one, is called this marginal treatment effect. So this looks similar to the previous estimate. This says that, this is, just look at this. It's kind of hard to explain, so I will quickly run through it. This basically say that the marginal treatment effect essentially is the average treatment effect for the families at the margin of change their fertility choice due to OCP. Like, this is a function of Z. So let's say Z is, say, IV value is 50%. Is 50%. Then this basically say that those are the families who would change their fertility choice if the resistance, the measure are raised to, say, 50%. So that was so for each Z, the Z is between 0 to 1 or 0 to 100%, right? So essentially, the marginal treatment effect is the families at the margin of change their fertility choice at the value, IV value of Z. So this is a continuous one, and then we can easily show. Let's say this. So importantly, if you look at these two estimates, in their definition, the conditional set, they're conditional on the joint distribution of the potential outcome of T under a bunch of the IV values, right? So this one, so they're called local effects, is because they're defined by on the subpopulation, defined by the joint potential outcomes. And Frangakis and Rubin, in 2002, of course, they have the famous paper called principal stratification. So essentially, this T, this type of the joint potential outcomes of the T, it's just principal stratification. And particularly important for this study is under assumption 1 and 3, 1 to 3, then Wittleiter has proved there's a latent selection representation. So in other words, that you can prove, actually under these assumptions, you can prove the treatment indicator, remember it's binary, it's just an indicator of a non-generated function, a monotone function in Z that is larger than S. Okay, what does this really mean? This really means that, this might look pretty complicated. Like this one seems to conditional on essentially the potential outcome of treatment under the whole range of IV value. But this result basically say that actually you only need to know a latent threshold. So this latent threshold of a person would switch its treatment, essentially having more than one child would change the fertility choice. So that's what this is about. Basically say that this whole thing looks complicated, but it's really a latent threshold. It's almost like the utility of violating OCP. Okay, that was the idea. So under that, then it become easy. It become easy because the marginal treatment effect, instead of looking at this, we can just say, okay, this essentially the marginal treatment effect is just a marginal equivalent to a treatment effect in a principal strata that defined by of one value. Well, of course, that's the threshold one would change their fertility choice. Okay, then with this, is the notation, everything is easy, and we also make the connection to the principal stratification literature, which is there's a rich literature there, and then we can easily show that actually the both ATT and the policy relevant treatment effect are just they're essentially integral, they're functions of the MTE. So the marginal treatment effect is kind of really a refined info of these two treatments. So then the question, okay, that all sounds good. How do we do inference, right? How do we do the modeling and inference? Well, we know that this is really a latent variable. So the principal stratification, well, this is at the latent threshold, one family would switch their treatment is really a latent variable. So what do we do is, well, we are using the Bayesian approach and to essentially impute this latent variable conditional on the covariates. So how do we do this? If you look at the likelihood, so we have, for each person, we have five pieces of data with the variables we care. So the latent threshold, the principal strata, basically need a selection, a model for a latent model for the latent principal stratum, and the other one is we need an outcome model conditional on the principal stratum. And then this part we just conditional use the empirical distribution, so we didn't need to model that. And how do we model that? Once you write that down, it becomes very easy, right? We mentioned that you have cluster data. Well, that's pretty easy. It's just a principal stratum. We use we can have a random effects model, give the province specific random effects, and then for the outcome is ordinal outcome, so that's fine. We can just use a proportional odds model for the ordinal outcome, and then we assume the conventional priors for this, and then we just combine that. So we use MC. So in each step, we will randomly draw the potential latent principal stratum, and then in the next step we will add conditionals on the latent stratum, and then we will draw the coefficients, the parameters from the outcome model. So that's all pretty standard. So this is result. After all that is the result. So we can see that, okay, so what do we see? This is a lot. This is a lot. So each of the column is one of the subgroups. So this is for rural female, this is rural male, and this is urban female, urban male, and then we have three measures. So there's a lot to digest here. I'll just quickly go through. So one thing we can see that is, first, for the rural female or for rural male, it really doesn't matter. It seems that, again, this is the marginal treatment effect. So the axis is the quantiles of the principal stratum or the resistance to the OCP. So you can see that for the rural male, it seems that there's across the three outcomes, it's just no difference. There's not much effect. But what is interesting is we find that for the rural female, at least for the confidence measure, there's a small but significant effect. It's pretty consistent across the IV value. And again, remember here, it's ordinal outcome, and this is all normalized. So it's between 1 to 5. So so this difference you might see is not too big, but it's something like towards the end is about 1. So that's like 20% of the difference. So essentially, it says that for rural females, there's a negative effect for the confidence. And what is more interesting is it seems that for the urban male and female, both urban male and female, there's a more significant effect going on. It looks like consistently the effect is across the spectrum, particularly as the resistance goes higher, the negative effect is the magnitude is increasing. So we saw that this basically say that there's negative effects for the urban population for all measures. So we were thinking that what can the reason be? It's like only children might be subject to more pressure from the parents, which they will influence mental health. And also we think that the rural children might have less restriction communicating with peers, so that leads to less harm due to being the only child. And another thing we noticed that apparently this results show us there's a heterogeneity with respect to a latent variable. So it's not like the effect is the same, and also there's a heterogeneity between different subgroups. And this is really the effect of this heterogeneity with respect to this resistance or this IV is really only detectable under this local IV framework, because we actually also calculate, in previous study, people just calculate the ATT or the population, the policy relevant treatment effect. So you can do that. We also did that. You can see that, well, then you can, instead of this, in this whole curve, you will see just a mean. And then, yeah, the pattern is pretty consistent, but again, you don't get that refined information. And this, we think, is important to do the local IV kind of analysis, is because of the heterogeneity. And so That's basically what we did. And so just a quick recap, we utilized the one-child policy implementation intensity as a nature experiment and use it as an instrumental variable. And then we apply that to the China family panel studies. And then we find that being an only child harms self-reported mental health measures. And we also observe that there's plenty of heterogeneity in terms of the treatment effect. And also with the observed covariates and unobserved the latent tendency to obey OCP. So the key thing is the local IV approach is central to the analysis, and then use Bayesian, and we made the connection, analytical connection between local IV and principal stratification that allow us to do very flexible Bayesian modeling. So that's it. Thank you for your attention, and don't know whether I have time for questions.
Oh, thank you very much. Actually, we are running a bit late. Thank you very much, Professor Fan Li, for the very nice study, and I hope parents in China will pay attention to your study and prevent those bad things from happening. So it's really meaningful, and yeah, I think it's very important.